My name is Margot Hayes, and I'm 66 years old. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how my quiet, ordinary life turned into something out of a nightmare. The day of my husband's funeral was the coldest, stillest day I've ever lived through. Even the wind seemed to mourn him. People whispered kind words, the pastor spoke of peace and eternal rest, but none of it reached me. I stood beside the casket of the man I had loved for 42 years, unable to believe he was really gone. Ernest wasn't just my husband. He was my anchor, my home. Losing him felt like the world had been pulled out from under my feet. I remember clutching my shawl tighter around me as the last shovelful of earth fell on the grave. Doris, my old friend, squeezed my hand, whispering that I had to be strong. I tried. God knows I tried. But then my phone vibrated in my purse. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another condolence message. When I looked down and saw the words on the screen, my blood turned to ice. I'm alive. For a moment, I thought my grief had broken my mind. The sender was an unknown number, the message short and impossible. I stared at it, unable to breathe. Then another came through, 3 words that shook me even more. That's not me. My fingers trembled as I typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons. The phone slipped from my hands and hit the grass beside the grave. My heart hammered as I looked around, at the mourners leaving, at the casket being lowered, at my sons standing together a few feet away. Charles and Henry. Their faces were solemn, their eyes red, but something about them felt wrong. Their expressions were too controlled, their tears too perfectly timed. "Mom, are you okay?" Charles asked, stepping toward me. His tone was soft, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm fine," I lied, quickly sliding the phone back into my purse. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that message. Was it a cruel prank? A mistake? Or could Ernest somehow still be alive? Every logical thought told me it was impossible. Yet the message said things only someone close could know. That night, as the house stood silent and cold, I stared at my husband's picture on the wall and whispered, "If you're out there, Ernest, please give me a sign." My phone vibrated again on the table beside me. Another message. The truth is buried deeper than the grave. My blood ran cold. Before everything fell apart, Ernest and I had lived a simple, beautiful life. We met when I was 24 in a small town called Spring Creek, where the days moved slow and everyone knew each other's stories. I was caring for my sick mother then, cleaning houses to make ends meet. Ernest worked in a tiny repair shop he'd inherited from his father. He fixed bicycles, lawnmowers, and anything else people brought to him with patience and quiet pride. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke much, but his eyes said everything. I still remember the first morning he called my name. I was walking to the market wearing a faded green dress and shoes that had seen better years. He leaned out of his shop, his hands stained with grease and his smile soft. "Morning, Margot," he said shyly. "Need me to look at your bike?" "I don't have a bike," I replied, laughing nervously, "but maybe you can help me find one someday." That one exchange turned into days of conversation, laughter, and moments beneath the big oak tree in Town Square Park. He would tell me stories about his father and dreams of opening a bigger shop someday. I would talk about my mother and how I wanted to make her proud. Love came quietly but deeply, like a gentle river carving through stone. When we married, we didn't have much, just each other and a handful of dreams. Our first home was a small 2-bedroom house with a tin roof that leaked every time it rained. But Ernest made it feel like a palace. We'd sit together placing pots under the drips and laugh when the rhythm of the falling rain became our music. When our first son, Charles, was born, I felt like the world had blessed us beyond measure. 2 years later came Henry, with the same wide eyes and stubborn smile. Those boys were our reason for everything. Ernest taught them to fish, to fix things with their hands, to value honesty and hard work. I taught them kindness, patience, and gratitude. We didn't have luxury, but we had love, the kind that holds families together through storms. Sometimes, when we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ernest would say, "Margot, we might not have money, but we're rich in everything that matters." And I believed him with all my heart. But as the years passed, I would learn something painful, that money can twist hearts faster than time can heal them. As Charles and Henry grew older, I began to see subtle changes that I didn't want to believe. At first, they were small, a sigh when Ernest came home covered in grease, an impatient glance when we couldn't afford something their friends had. But those small cracks widened with time. Charles, our eldest, was ambitious from the start. He always wanted more, nicer clothes, a bigger house, a different life. When Ernest offered him a job at the shop after high school, Charles laughed. "I'm not wasting my life fixing old bikes, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." The words cut through Ernest like a blade. I still remember that night, watching my husband sit on the porch staring at the stars in silence. His pride was wounded, but he never spoke badly of his son. "He just wants a better life," Ernest said quietly. "Maybe that's a good thing." Henry, 2 years younger, followed his brother like a shadow. Whatever Charles wanted, he wanted too. If Charles dismissed his father's trade, so did Henry. If Charles bragged about city life, Henry echoed every word. They were inseparable, but not in the way brothers should be. It wasn't love binding them. It was ambition. When Charles turned 25, he found a job at a real estate firm in the city. Within a few years, he was earning more money than Ernest and I had seen in our whole marriage. Henry followed soon after, joining him in business. I was proud, truly proud at first. I thought we'd done something right, that our sacrifices had given them the life we could never have. But the joy didn't last. The visits grew fewer, the phone calls shorter. When they did come home, it wasn't really to see us, it was to show us what they'd become. They'd pull up in expensive cars, dressed in tailored suits, speaking with arrogance that didn't belong to the boys I'd raised. Charles once looked around our little home and said, "You and Dad should move somewhere better. This place looks tired." I told him this house wasn't tired. It was alive with memories. He just smiled politely, as if he couldn't wait to leave. That night, Ernest said something I'll never forget. "Money didn't change the world, Margot. It just changed our sons." His eyes were full of quiet heartbreak. I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted to believe my boys still loved us. But love, I would soon learn, means nothing when greed takes its place. Charles's success came with a woman who mirrored his new world perfectly. Her name was Jasmine Albright, a city-born woman with polished nails, high heels, and a gaze that could make anyone feel small. The first time she visited our home, she stepped out of their sleek car and looked around like she'd arrived at a forgotten village. Her red dress shimmered under the sun, too elegant for the dust of Spring Creek. "Nice to meet you," she said, stretching her hand halfway before pulling it back. Her smile was thin, her tone polite but distant. I tried my best to welcome her, serving the meatloaf I had spent all afternoon preparing. But she barely touched her plate, moving the food around with her fork as if afraid it might stain her manicure. Charles kept whispering apologies to her. "Next time we'll eat out," he said softly, thinking I couldn't hear. But I did, and those words stayed with me longer than I expected. After that visit, things only grew colder. Charles called less, and when he did, Jasmine's voice was always somewhere in the background, giving suggestions, correcting him, managing him. Henry, still single but just as detached, began to act the same way, restless, impatient, distant. One afternoon, during what was supposed to be a family dinner, Charles unfolded a set of papers on the table. "Mom, Dad," he began, smiling in that rehearsed way of his, "I've been thinking about your future. This house is old, worth maybe $1,000 at best. If you sell it, I can help you buy something smaller, more comfortable." Ernest looked up slowly from his coffee. "This house raised you, son," he said quietly. "Comfort isn't about walls. It's about what lives inside them." But Charles wasn't listening. "Dad, you're 70 now. You shouldn't be working anymore. It's time to retire before something happens." Henry nodded quickly. "We can't keep worrying about you getting hurt in that shop." Their concern sounded rehearsed, their care too calculated. I watched Ernest's jaw tighten, the calm in his eyes turning into something heavier, disappointment. That night, he told me, "Margot, they're not asking us to rest. They're asking us to disappear." He wasn't wrong. Over the next few weeks, real estate agents began showing up at our door, saying Charles had sent them. They spoke as if the sale was already decided. Jasmine mentioned retirement communities with a smirk, as though we were children who couldn't be trusted with our own lives. I kept hoping it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down I knew something had shifted. Love had turned into calculation, and our sons were beginning to treat us as obstacles standing in the way of their next fortune. The last time I saw Ernest truly smile was 3 weeks before he died. We were sitting on the porch sipping coffee when Charles came to visit alone. He looked tense, distracted, but he forced a smile as he sat down. "Mom," he said, his voice unusually calm, "I just want you to know that no matter what happens, Henry and I will always take care of you." At that moment, I thought it was his way of comforting me as Ernest's health began to show signs of age. But now, remembering those words, I realized they carried a warning I didn't understand then. No matter what happens, that Tuesday morning started like any other. Ernest left early for the shop, waving at me with that quiet grin that had warmed me for 40 years. I was making his favorite lunch, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, when the phone rang. "Mrs. Hayes?" A serious voice asked. "This is Memorial Hospital. Your husband's been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." My whole body froze. The world went blurry. "Is he alive? What happened?" I begged, but the voice only repeated, "Please come at once." Our neighbor, Doris, drove me because I was shaking too badly to hold the wheel. When we arrived, my sons were already there. That startled me. How could they know so quickly? No one had called them. I was the emergency contact. But I was too panicked to question it. Charles hugged me tightly, almost too tightly. "Mom, the doctor said it was a machine explosion at the shop. Dad has burns and a head injury. He's critical." When I finally saw Ernest, I barely recognized him. Bandages covered his face and arms. Machines beeped beside him. I held his hand, whispering, "I'm here, my love. You'll pull through. You always do." For a moment, I felt the faintest squeeze of his fingers. A flicker of life. But the nurse shook her head gently. "Sometimes it's just reflexes," she said softly. I knew it wasn't. Ernest was trying to tell me something. For 3 days, I barely left his side. Charles and Henry stayed too, but their focus seemed elsewhere. I caught pieces of their conversations, insurance, policy amounts, beneficiaries. My stomach turned. My husband was fighting for his life, and my sons were calculating his worth. On the 3rd night, the doctor called us into his office. "Mrs. Hayes," he said with pity in his eyes, "your husband's condition is irreversible. You should prepare for the worst." Before I could speak, Charles said quietly, "Maybe we should let him go, Mom. Dad wouldn't want to live like this." I looked at him horrified. "He's your father, not a burden." But that was the first time I saw the truth in his eyes. Cold, unfeeling, waiting. 2 days after the machines went silent, Ernest was gone. I remember the time, 4:37 in the morning. The nurses said his heart simply stopped. Mine did too. I held his still hand until it turned cold, whispering prayers through tears that wouldn't stop. I had lost my husband, my best friend, my whole world. But my sons, they didn't cry. Not the way sons should. When they arrived an hour later, their faces looked composed, almost rehearsed. Charles carried paperwork. Henry spoke to the doctor about next steps. They were efficient, detached, practical. It felt wrong. "Mom," Charles said softly, "we've already contacted the funeral home. They'll pick up Dad this morning. We also called the insurance company to start the claim." It took me a few seconds to understand his words. Insurance claim? Ernest hadn't even been buried yet, and they were already talking about money. My grief turned to confusion, then quiet rage. But I said nothing. I was too broken to fight. The funeral came quickly, too quickly. Charles arranged everything without asking my opinion. He chose a cheap coffin, a short service, and only a handful of guests. I wanted to invite Ernest's friends from the shop, the neighbors, the people who'd loved him. But Charles said Dad was a private man. He'd have wanted something simple. That wasn't true. Ernest loved people. He loved being surrounded by his community. On the day of the funeral, the sky hung low and gray. Rain drizzled softly as we gathered around the grave. Only 6 people stood there. Me, Doris, the pastor, Charles, Henry, and Jasmine. For a man who had spent 70 years in the same town, it was an insult. I looked at my sons. Their expressions were cold, distant. Henry kept checking his watch. Jasmine scrolled her phone behind a black veil. Only I cried. As the pastor said his final words, I felt something inside me collapse. The sound of earth hitting the coffin echoed like thunder in my soul. I wanted to scream. I wanted Ernest back. But all I could do was whisper goodbye. Then, as if the world itself paused, my phone buzzed in my purse. I almost ignored it. When I finally looked, the screen showed a message from an unknown number. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. My breath stopped. I typed with trembling fingers. Who is this? The reply came seconds later. I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons. My blood ran cold. I looked at Charles and Henry standing by the grave, their faces unreadable, their hands folded neatly in front of them. A chill crept up my spine. Something was horribly wrong. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in our quiet house, staring at the phone as if it held the key to a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The message echoed in my mind, I'm alive. Don't trust our sons. The words felt impossible, yet every instinct inside me whispered they were true. I thought about the accident, the so-called explosion at Ernest's shop. He had worked in that place for over 40 years, knew every wire and bolt like the back of his hand. He was careful to a fault. An explosion didn't make sense. And how had my sons arrived at the hospital before I did when the call came to me first? The more I replayed everything, the less it fit together. By morning, I decided I needed answers. I went to Ernest's old desk where he kept all our important papers, insurance forms, property documents, everything. Inside a small metal box, I found the policy Charles had mentioned at the hospital. Only it wasn't what I remembered. Ernest's life insurance had always been small, just enough to cover burial costs. But 6 months earlier, it had been changed, raised from $5,000 to $50,000. My hands trembled. Ernest would never have done that without telling me. Then I saw another file. A new workers' compensation policy, purchased just 2 months before his death, covering accidental death on the job. The payout? $15,000 more. And suddenly it all began to form a pattern. My husband had been worth more dead than alive. Just then, my phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. Check the bank account. Look at the withdrawals. I grabbed my coat and went straight to the bank. Mrs. Thompson, the manager who'd known us for decades, greeted me kindly. I'm so sorry for your loss, Margot, she said. Ernest was one of the good ones. Thank you, I whispered. I need to see our statements for the last few months. When she printed them, I froze. 3 large withdrawals, $1,000 in January, $3,000 in February, $4,000 in March. Ernest had never spent that kind of money without telling me. Who made these withdrawals? I asked. Your husband, she said. I remember him coming in with one of your sons, Charles, I believe. He said your husband's eyesight wasn't good enough for paperwork. But Ernest's eyes were fine. He never went anywhere without his glasses. I looked at the signatures. They were shaky, uncertain. Someone had forged them. Mrs. Thompson looked puzzled. Is something wrong? Yes, I said quietly, my voice trembling. Everything. That night, another message came. The insurance was their idea. They convinced him it was to protect you. It was a trap. And that was when I realized Ernest hadn't just died. He had been hunted. I didn't sleep at all that night. The messages, the forged signatures, the fake explosion, it all swirled in my mind like a storm refusing to calm. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. The stranger who had been messaging me said there was more evidence at Ernest's shop. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I drove there early, the streets still damp from morning rain. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. Everything was spotless. Too spotless. There were no burn marks, no broken equipment, not even a hint of smoke damage. For a place where a machine supposedly exploded, it looked untouched. I whispered to the empty room, "Where's the accident, Ernest?" Then I noticed his old wooden desk pushed against the wall. It looked slightly moved, as if someone had gone through it in a hurry. I knelt down and pulled open the drawers. Beneath old invoices and a few rusted tools, I found a folded piece of paper, Ernest's handwriting. My heart began to race. The note was dated 3 days before his death. Charles insists I take out a bigger insurance policy. Says it's to protect Margot. But something feels wrong. He's too insistent. I don't trust it. My throat tightened. Beneath it was another note, this one shakier. Henry brought new documents for me to sign. He says it's to modernize the shop, but I don't understand the language. Why the rush? I pressed the pages to my chest, tears spilling down my face. Ernest had known. He had sensed their deception, but he hadn't realized how far it would go. Then I found something even more chilling. An envelope with my name written across the front in Ernest's careful script. I opened it with trembling hands. My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. Our sons are not the boys we raised. I fear they care more for money than for us. Be careful. Don't trust their smiles. Protect yourself. I love you, always. I sat on the dusty floor of that shop crying until my throat ached. He had tried to warn me. I had ignored the signs. That evening, Charles came by unexpectedly. He carried a bottle of wine and that familiar false smile. "Mom, we just want to help you manage the insurance money," he said. "It's a lot for someone your age." Jasmine nodded sweetly. "We can invest it for you, make it grow." Their voices were sugar over poison. I pretended to agree, but inside I knew what they were doing, and I was done being their victim. The days that followed felt unreal. Every smile from my sons looked sharper, every word carried a double edge. I was living in the same house as ghosts. Ghosts of the children I had raised and the man they had killed. Then one afternoon, both Charles and Henry arrived together. Their visit was sudden and unannounced, which was unusual. They came bearing pastries and polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Jasmine followed behind, dressed in black again, as if mourning was her costume. "Mom," Charles began, his voice smooth as honey, "we've been worried about you. Dora says you've been acting strange lately. Not eating. Talking to yourself." I stiffened. Doris had said no such thing. "I'm fine," I replied, though my heart raced. Henry leaned forward. "We just want to help. Grief can make people see things that aren't there." Then Jasmine placed the pastries on the table, opening the box slowly. "I brought your favorite. You haven't eaten properly in days." I remembered the warning from the mysterious messages. "Don't take anything they offer you to eat or drink." My stomach twisted. "Thank you," I said calmly, "but I already ate." They exchanged a look, quick, nervous, loaded with meaning. Then Charles sighed, his mask slipping just a little. "Mom, we need to talk about your condition. Henry and I spoke with Dr. Albright. He believes you may be showing early signs of paranoia brought on by grief." My condition. Paranoia. My pulse pounded in my ears. "I haven't spoken to any doctor," I said coldly. "He evaluated your behavior through our descriptions," Henry said carefully. "He thinks you'd benefit from supervised care. Maybe a community for older adults, someplace safe, a retirement home." Their plan was clear now. If they couldn't manipulate me, they'd declare me insane and take control of everything I owned. Charles smiled, too calm. "You can come voluntarily, or we can have the court step in. Judge Miller's already reviewing the papers." The air felt like it was closing in around me. They weren't my sons anymore. They were predators in suits, circling their prey. I forced myself to nod, pretending to think it over. "Let me sleep on it," I said softly. "You're probably right. I need time to clear my head." Charles patted my hand. "Take your time, Mom, but not too much." When they left, I locked the door and sank into the nearest chair. I was shaking, but I wasn't broken. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "They'll move tomorrow. Don't let them win. Help is coming. Help, but from who?" The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table waiting for whatever was coming. The house felt too quiet, too heavy with secrets. When my phone buzzed again, I jumped. It was the same unknown number, the one that had haunted me since Ernest's funeral. "Margot, my name is Stephen Callahan. I'm a private investigator. Your husband hired me weeks before his death. He suspected your sons. Meet me today at 3 p.m. at the corner cafe." For a moment, I couldn't move. My husband had hired a private investigator? Ernest had known they were planning something and tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. I gathered my coat, tucked the old letters from his desk into my purse, and left. At exactly 3, I walked into the cafe, my heart thudding. The smell of roasted coffee felt almost comforting, a lie in the middle of chaos. I sat at the back as the message instructed. A few minutes later, a tall, gray-haired man approached me. His eyes were kind but serious. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "I'm Stephen. I'm so sorry for your loss." He placed a brown folder on the table. "What I'm about to show you will hurt, but it's the truth." He opened the folder and pulled out a small voice recorder. When he pressed play, Ernest's voice filled the air, fragile but steady. "Stephen, if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. My sons are pressuring me to increase my insurance. They say it's for Margot's protection, but I've read the documents. They benefit them directly." Tears blurred my vision. Hearing Ernest's voice again was like being struck in the heart. Stephen clicked to the next recording. This time, it was Charles's voice. Cold, controlled, calculating. "We can't wait any longer. The old man's starting to suspect. The methanol will make it look like a stroke. No one will question it." My breath hitched. I felt the room tilt. "My God," I whispered. Stephen nodded grimly. "They poisoned his morning coffee." The methanol mimicked a stroke, and by the time the hospital realized it wasn't, it was too late. He showed me photographs next. Charles leaving a hardware store with a small bottle in his hand. The date stamped 5 days before Ernest's death. Then came documents. Financial statements showing massive debts. Charles owed $70,000, Henry $40,000. Desperation had driven them. "I have all the evidence," Stephen said. "Recordings, receipts, the doctor's falsified report. And there's more. They're planning to have you declared mentally incompetent tomorrow morning." I clenched my fists. "Then we stop them tonight," he nodded. "I'll call Sergeant O'Connell at the station. He's one of the few honest officers left. We'll take everything straight to him." For the first time in months, I felt something other than grief. Purpose. Ernest's killers thought they'd silenced him forever, but they had forgotten one thing. They hadn't silenced me. That night, Stephen and I drove straight to the police station. The air outside was cold and still, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Sergeant O'Connell was working the night shift, a man Ernest had known for years. When we entered his office, he looked up in confusion. "Mrs. Hayes," he said kindly, "what brings you here so late?" I placed the folder on his desk, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. "Sergeant, I'm here to file a formal complaint for the murder of my husband, Ernest Hayes." He blinked. "Murder? But the report says it was a work accident." "A machine explosion." "That report is false," I said. "My husband was poisoned. By our own sons." Stephen opened the folder, laying out every piece of evidence. The audio recordings, the photographs of Charles buying methanol, the bank statements showing withdrawals, the forged signatures, and finally, the medical report proving Ernest's health was perfect before his death. As each detail unfolded, O'Connell's face grew graver. He leaned back in his chair, his expression tight. "Good God," he muttered. "This is monstrous." "The doctor who falsified the death certificate was bribed," Stephen added. "We can prove it. We also have recorded conversations between the sons planning the murder and discussing how to declare Mrs. Hayes mentally unfit." The sergeant stood up, pacing. "We'll need the medical examiner to exhume Ernest's body to confirm the poisoning." "Do it," I said firmly. "Whatever it takes." O'Connell immediately called the district attorney. Despite the late hour, the DA came to the station personally. After reviewing everything, he said, "We'll issue arrest warrants for Charles and Henry before dawn. We can't risk them destroying more evidence." Stephen drove me home afterward. The roads were empty, moonlight stretching across the fields like silver threads. "You've been brave, Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "Not brave," I replied, looking out the window. "Just a woman with nothing left to lose." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Ernest's photo in front of me. "We're close, my love," I whispered. "They'll pay for what they did." At dawn, sirens pierced the calm. Through my window, I saw police cars speeding down opposite roads, one toward Charles's house, the other toward Henry's. My phone began to ring. Their names flashed on the screen, one after another. I didn't answer. An hour later, Sergeant O'Connell knocked on my door. His face was serious, but his tone was steady. "Mrs. Hayes, it's done. Both your sons are under arrest for first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder." I sank into my chair, trembling. The storm had finally broken. Charles confessed. O'Connell continued softly. "Henry tried to run, but we caught him. They'll both face trial." For the first time in months, I could breathe. The trial began 2 months later, and by then, our quiet town of Spring Creek had turned into a place buzzing with disbelief. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. Newspapers printed headlines like, "Sons accused of poisoning their father for money." Every eye was on me, the mother who had reported her own children. When I walked into the courtroom, my knees trembled, but I lifted my chin high. I wore a simple black dress, the same one I'd worn on my wedding day, now transformed into my armor of mourning and dignity. Stephen sat beside me, his presence steady, his hand resting protectively over the folder that had changed everything. Charles and Henry entered moments later, handcuffed, wearing orange prison jumpsuits. Seeing them like that tore something inside me. For a split second, I saw not killers, but the boys who once ran barefoot through our yard, laughing as Ernest chased them with a garden hose. Then I blinked and the illusion vanished. The men before me were strangers. The prosecutor began the case with brutal precision. Every recording played out like a knife to the heart. Charles's voice. "The methanol will look like a stroke." Henry's voice. "Once Dad's gone, we'll take care of Mom, too." The audience gasped, and some even cried. Each word cut through the courtroom like thunder. When my turn came to testify, I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I raised my sons with love," I said softly, "and that love became the weapon they used against us. Ernest believed in family more than anything, and they betrayed him for a handful of dollars." My voice trembled, but I didn't break. "He was a good man. He deserved better." By the third day, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury took only 6 hours to return the verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge's voice was calm but final. "Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, for the premeditated murder of your father and the conspiracy to murder your mother, I sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for 30 years. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but I felt only silence, a deep, cleansing silence that wrapped around me like a long-delayed breath. After the sentencing, I went home and sat on the porch where Ernest and I had shared so many sunsets. For the first time since his death, I felt him there with me. Not in pain, but at peace. Months later, I used the insurance money to build something new, the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. We help people who, like me, were betrayed by the ones they loved most. It became my purpose, my redemption, my way of turning tragedy into light. 5 years have passed. The roses in the garden bloom brighter each spring. Stephen visits every Wednesday for coffee, and together we tend to the flowers where Ernest's shop once stood. I still visit his grave every Sunday, laying fresh blooms and whispering, "Justice was done, my love. They can't hurt us anymore." As the wind brushes through the trees, I swear I can almost hear him whisper back, "You kept your promise, Margot." And I smile, because I know I did.